So this is what we did last week. We looked at this chart. This is a complete copy paste of the parak of that we are studying, chapter 6, with the difference being that I've divided it into three parts. The command God to Yehoshua, Yehoshua's command instructions to the people, and the fulfillment, the actual implementation of Yehoshua's command. And what it enables us to see, and I've highlighted the parts that are not in the original command of God, or that don't appear in the text that way. And as we've seen, there are three elements. One is the placement of Reuven Gad, the Chalutz, at the beginning, and the Masef, the rest of the camp, after. That's less significant for us right now. But the other two are what I've highlighted in green and yellow. Yellow is to save Rachav and fulfill the promise to Rachav, which required a unique kind of divine providence and approval, because it meant that when the walls came down and in a kind of an earthquake style, that her house stood standing. That was the oath that Yehoshua had taken to save her life. And the second, which is the start of our discussion today, is this cherem. So let's start from there, where Yehoshua says, actually, I'm going to read it in the text itself with the translation. So let's go to here, if you don't mind. Let's jump to Pasuk Yud, Yud Tetzayin, let's say. ויהי בפעם השביעית תקעו הכהנים בשופרות ויאמר יהושע על העם הריעו כי נתן השם לכם את העיר. The seventh circuit, Yehoshua declares to the people, call out, cry out, God has given you this city now. והייתה העיר חרם. The city shall become a cherem. Now, cherem is a very difficult word to translate because it has so many different meanings. It can mean a ban, it can mean something which is sanctified or devoted to the temple, as is the case here, or the Mishkan. It can mean something which is destroyed. Lahachrim is to destroy. It can be something which is excommunicated or banned or not have any benefit from, which is to put something or somebody into cherem, as we use it in the rabbinic language. So the word cherem is extraordinarily difficult, and when it's used, it sometimes is used in multiple ways in the same verse, as we'll see here, kind of a play or pun on the word. The city shall become a cherem. Rechav's life will be spared. Guard yourself from taking of the cherem, in that this context referring to the spoils of war. Pen tacharimu, lest you destroy yourselves, ulakachtem min cherem, by taking of the cherem. So you can see in this one half a sentence, three uses of the term cherem, each one being different. It's the power of this particular small word. V'samtemet machanei Yisrael cherem, and then you will bring about a destruction, that's a fourth application of the term, to the entire camp of Israel, v'achartem oto, and you will cause it trouble. Mayim akuim are muddied waters, right? Dirty waters. Achartem is a very harsh word for to make something accursed or troubled. So what can you do? What should you do with the spoils of war? It is sanctified to God. All the gold, silver, all of the spoils of war are kodesh, and kodesh is a synonym for cherem in one application of the word cherem. Right? That's exactly why it's so complicated. And they will come to the Mishkan Mikdash Otzai Hashem Yavo. And that's in fact what happens. The walls fall and they go into the city. They cry out, Vayacharimu et kol asher ba'ir. They destroy everything that is in the city. Me'ish v'yadisha mina v'yad zaken. So there's a total combat role in this war. Talked about that language before. We'll leave it for now. Everything, the ox and the cattle, etc. And Rachav's life was spared. And the city was burnt to the ground. So the gold and silver, that which could be moved, chattels were brought to the Mishkan, to the Otsar Beit Hashem, Berek Habayit, and the city itself was burnt, was destroyed, was razed to the ground. And then at the end of the parak, Yashba Yehoshua ba'et lemor arur ish lifnei Hashem asher yakumu v'na ta'ir azot et Yericho. Cursed is anybody who will rebuild Yericho. So now it's not only destroyed in that sense of a cherem, but now there's a cherem in the application of the way we use it rabbinic language, right, to excommunicate something or to prohibit something. So now the entire city of Yericho is in cherem and cannot be rebuilt ever. And cursed is the one who will rebuild it, or who may rebuild it. With his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates. Meaning, right, if he has the chutzpah and the audacity to violate this curse, he shall pay the ultimate price, not just only with his own life, but with the lives of his family. And that is the beginning of the story of the conquest of Canaan. So we are puzzled, and we talked about this last week, we're puzzled by this cherem of Yehoshua. The first question we asked was, God did not command Yehoshua this cherem. Why did Yehoshua do it? Did he do it on his own initiative? Did God instruct him to do so? And we saw various possibilities. We saw various opinions. Some of the Mepharshim say that Yehoshua must have been commanded, says the Radak, because otherwise he wouldn't have invented such a wild scheme. Whereas the Yerushalmi, Medrash Tanchum, and others suggest, no, Yehoshua on his own banned Yericho, and God agreed. And how do we know that God agreed? Because the consequences of Yeshua's ban next week, in the next chapter, we see is in Perek Zayin and Chet, when Achan violates the cherem, steals from the spoils of war, and causes in his Chet a punishment for all of Israel because they lose the next battle. And God says to Yehoshua, it's specifically because they violated this cherem. So God must have agreed to the cherem, because otherwise he wouldn't have held all of Israel accountable for that which Yehoshua initiated on his own. That's the theory. That leaves us really with the big question, which is why? Why did Yehoshua introduce it, or why did God command it or imply it? What is the purpose of this cherem? And to understand this, we're going to offer four, what I hope we'll get to today, 3, and then one more in the next year, 4 different explanations to what the cherem is. If cherem has so many different words and so many different meanings, it's probably true that there are multiple explanations for what this cherem is all about. So that's what we're going to explore. I want to take us all the way back to the beginning of what the word cherem means and where it first appears, or where it appears in its, let's call it halachic context or legal context. And that's a verse in Vayikra Perek Chav Zayin, which is the very, very end of Parshat Bechukatai, the end of Sefer Vayikra. There's a chapter that appears after the Tochacha, after the admonitions. There's one chapter which deals with a very strange concept in the Torah called Erchen. Erchen means you take an oath to donate a certain amount to the temple. You can either take an oath to donate a person's worth, value, so to speak, which is essentially a neder, which is essentially a way of saying whatever they can make in the workforce, whatever their value is in the workforce. That's what the neder is. But the more common application is what the Torah refers to as erech, or erech arachin, really. It's often mispronounced as erchin, but arachin, meaning that that there is a stipulated, predetermined amount, almost arbitrary amount, I would add, that is represented by age and gender, etc. And the person takes an erech, he's essentially saying, I'm committing that amount to the temple. Okay. It's a kind of an easy way to chart out how much a person wanted to donate to the Mikdash. And then at the end of all of this is an entire tractate in the Talmud called Masechet Arachin, which is devoted to this perek. And at the very end of it, we find the following verse. Ach kol cherem asher yacharim ish laHashem mikol asher lo מאדם ובהמה ומזבח וזתו, לא יימכר ולא ייגאל. Any cherem, ban, anything which has been prescribed in this context, which a person declares, prescribes it for God, Yachrim ish laHashem, from anything that he owns, man, beast, animal, anything, field. Lo yimacher v'lo yigael, cannot be redeemed, cannot be sold. Rather, it's devoted to the temple. Kol cherem kodesh kodeshimu laHashem. It is sanctified to God. Now, it's easy that you can sanctify a behemah, you can sanctify a field. A person is a little more complicated, so there's some discussion as whether that's referring to an eved or an actual person. But Pasuk Chavtet comes along and says, "Kol cherem asher yocharam min ha'adam lo yipadem mot yumat." Any cherem prescribed of a person cannot be redeemed or ransomed; that they have to be put to death. That is extraordinarily difficult to understand. What is that referring to? So there's two understandings or two levels of interpretation. One is the halachic interpretation. The Tosefta kind of summarizes probably 2/3 of Tractate Erchin in this sentence, that this text above seems to refer to three different kinds of cherem. Shlosha charamin hein. The first is kol cherem asher yocharam ish laHashem, anything that is so banned, prescribed, that goes to the temple, that goes Kodesh Kodeshim, that is referred to Charmei Kohanim. It goes to the Kohanim. Animals, fields, possessions, they get donated to a cherem. It means that they become the possession of the Kohen class in the temple. Kol cherem Kodesh Kodeshimu laHashem, if a person says that they are a cherem, Kodesh Kodeshim, that means that they're an animal that can be brought as an offering on the Mizbeach. Elu Charmei Gavoah. So that's a different kind of dedication. Kol cherem asher yocharam min ha'adam, that's referring to chayvei mitot beit din. That's referring to somebody who has already committed a crime for which the Beit Din has declared a capital punishment. And a person wants to come along and say, you know what, instead of killing them for the capital crime, I will redeem them with a certain amount. I will buy them or buy off the death penalty that was so prescribed to them. That the Torah says is not allowed. Lo yipadeh mot yumat. Ramban argues, correctly so I believe, that that is true halachically, but not necessarily the pshat of the verse. The pshat of the verse is much more powerful and related more to our discussion. Namely, Aderech HaPshat, Yomar Katuv, Ki kol ha'machrim mishalo ben adam ben ma'amizdach uzato kodesh l'Hashem. If a person takes a cherem of his own possessions, meaning he declares a cherem on something he owns, he's essentially, it's a way of devoting it, dedicating it to God, to the temple, to the service. If a person makes a cherem on over a person, he puts into cherem a person who's not his own possession, he's not a slave or an eved Ivri or an eved Knani, he says that that person is in cherem. What is that referring to? Says the Ramban, Kigon hanilchamim al oivehem. In the midst of war, it was common practice in the days of Tanakh, and we see it both in terms of actual events taking place in Chumash, and later here we see it again. It was common practice in the midst of battle for a person to take an oath and say to God, Nodrim Neder, and say, Im naton titen et ha'am hazeh biyadi v'acharati et aleihem. If God will give me this nation into my hands, I will destroy their cities. I will declare the cities cherem. Then there's no option of surrendering in the sense that you can't take them as slaves. The big issue in Tanakh, and we've talked about this before, is the question of whether you fight for the purpose of capturing the prisoners of war or the people who you capture alive and enslave them in servitude, or you fight until your victory is declared. So in this case, Yamutu kol ha'adam hanimtza behem, you fight until victory is declared. Because it's as if to say the word cherem is asur b'hana'ah, that they are prohibited from any benefit to me. I can't take them and use them in my own service, but rather this is a way of declaring that I will fight until victory. Nitkaven lachrit ha'ovim ulachalota. And very famously, by the way, one of the most potent examples of this in Tanakh, which was completely corrupted in its original intent, was Yiftach, who took exactly such a oath regarding whoever walks out of his house after the battle, which is a story B'ezrat Hashem one day we'll learn in Sefer Shoft. So that's the concept of cherem. Now, in our discussion of Yericho, that seems to be reflected in the pshat of what Yehoshua is trying to declare. He's trying to say, "Acherem, the possessions of the city are off limits. They're asur b'hana'ah. You can't take them for yourself. You can't own them. You can't steal them. Right? This is kodesh, and when Achan does, it's a violation of the cherem. And at the same time, the notion was that when they entered the city to fight, they entered the city to fight until it was defeated, so that they could raise the city to the ground. V'yachrimu et kol asher ba'ir. Right, and the animals were killed. What they do, the women and children, is a whole different issue. We'll talk about that another time. And they spared Rachav's life, but when they came to the city, v'yirsafu ba'esh. The clay chesef, zahav, and choshet, they brought to the Atzar Beit Hashem, they brought to the Mikdash, and the rest of the city they destroyed. That's exactly what it seems to refer to in this context. Doesn't answer the question of why. Why was it so important? What was the purpose of such a ban? And the corollary question, which is, there's no such ban on any other city. Meaning Yericho was the only city Yeshua conquers for which this cherem was declared. So whatever understanding we have for the cherem, it has to be something which can be applied uniquely to Yericho and not to any other city that they conquered. That's the trick. So we're going to begin that exploration. What are the options? And Kidakenu, we're going to start with a midrash that summarizes exactly this question. It's going to offer various different answers, each one of them unique, and each one of them needs to be unpacked and understood. So the midrash is referring to a verse about Ephraim was Voshi, Yehoshua was from Shevet Ephraim, and says the midrash, and here's where our story begins. Vehu Asa milchama b'Shabbat. Yehoshua waged war on Shabbat. How do I know he waged war on Shabbat? Because it says 6 days they walked around the city with one hakafa and one blast of the shofar. And on the seventh day, vahi bayom hashvi'i, vayashkimu kalot hashacha, vayasobu et yeshiva pamim. They surrounded the city 7 times. Menayin she'ata Shabbat. How do I know it was Shabbat? She'en shiva le'olam b'lo Shabbat. Whether the 7th day was Shabbat or day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 was Shabbat, you can't have a sequence of 7 days without Shabbat. So clearly they're fighting on Shabbat. More so, by Yom Hashvi'i typically is referring to either the 7th day of the sequence, but also a remez or an allusion, a reference to the concept of Shabbat in the way we understand it. And that's how the continuation of the Medrash reads. Ulefi she'haya Yom Shabbat, since that 7th day was in fact Shabbat, Oto Yom shekavshu et Yericho, l'chach hechrim et Yericho kodesh l'Hashem. That's why Yehoshua declared it cherem and kodesh. As it says, Vaytahe ir cherem, hi v'chol asher ba l'Hashem. It's cherem to God. What was the rationale, says Yehoshua? Amar Yehoshua, HaShabbat kula kodesh. Shabbat is all together a holy day. Therefore, kol ma shenichbash b'Shabbat yeh kodesh l'Hashem. If something is conquered on Shabbat, it should be kodesh. L'chein hu omer, kol kesef v'zahav v'chlei v'zel kodesh hu l'Hashem otza Hashem yavo. Now you understand that we have to understand the concept, but that explanation, we'll get to the other two in a moment, that explanation appears actually in Rashi. Rashi on the pasuk Vaytah ir cherem explains that it's hekdesh, it's kodesh, ki hayom Shabbat kodesh. That's exactly what Rashi says. The day is Shabbat. kodesh shalal hanishlalba, and therefore all the booty and all the spoils that were captured, it has the characteristic of something which is like muksa. Right? Muksa is a similar concept. It's off limits. It's off limits. It's holy. This is Shabbos. We had to take the city, but we didn't necessarily. If the fact that it was taken on Shabbos means that it has a special status. That's true. It would assume, however, a very big assumption, which is not necessarily borne out in the rest of the book, but there's no evidence either way. But you would have to make the assumption that no other battle in Sefer Yehoshua took place on Shabbat. Because Yericho was a unique cherem. There is no other cherem on any other city. So you have to assume if the reason was because they conquered it on Shabbat, so no other city was conquered on Shabbat. Is that possible? Yes. Do I have evidence to support that? No. Okay. I'm going to skip the second explanation for a moment and look at the third. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Levi bar Shalom. Limed li Yisrael ma she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yehoshua taught Bnei Yisrael a very important lesson, a lesson written in the Torah, where Reshit Arisotachem Chala Trumat Tarimu Truma. The first of your dough you shall set aside, Afrashat Chala we call it, as Truma, as a gift to God, given to the Kohanim, etc. Amar Yehoshua, Va'il v'kavashnu ota tchila, since Yericho was first, nakdish et kol shlala l'kavoah. We will sanctify, devote all of its spoils to God. The idea being that what made Yericho unique, according to Rabbi Yehuda bar Shalom, was not necessarily that it was conquered on Shabbat. We don't have proof to that, but it was the first city in the land of Israel to be conquered, to be taken, and therefore the question is, what's its status? According to Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to make it Kodesh because every first in our possessions and that which we have in the land of Israel, everything that's a first is given to Bikurim, first fruits, given to God, given to the temple, Truma, Challah, the first of the baking of the dough, the first of the produce of the fields, Omer, every time there's a harvest, every time there's something which we're going to take for ourselves, the first of it, first, whatever percentage it is, the first has to be donated to God. I have to recognize that ultimately everything comes from God. If we're able to do so here, it's because God enabled us to do so. The first gets mukdash, gets sanctified to cherem l'Hashem. That essentially is where the Radak lands in his explanation. Amar Yehoshua, Yericho kfushat tchila le'eretz Yisrael. Yericho was the first city conquered in the land of Israel. Notziena truma. We will make it a truma, a gift to God. Ka'isha hazot shemafreshet chalata mitchilat isata. Like somebody is baking and makes challah. You take challah, we call it Shabbos bread, we call it challah, right? But challah is the term used for the removal of the first dough devoted and given to either the Kohanim or the Mikdash, in case of the temple, or today it is burnt. And then the Radak mentions this other reason about Shabbat, but I think he lands really, between Rashi and Radak, you have exactly these two explanations. Either it's inherently Kadosh, because it was a day of Shabbat that was holy, or because it's the first. It is devoted to, like Truma and Challah, devoted to God. The advantage of the second explanation, which the Radak embraces, is that it explains why Yericho was unique. I don't have to assume that no other city was conquered in Shabbat, right? There's only ever going to be one first city, and that would be Yericho, so therefore Yericho would have that status. Both of these explanations, Rashi and Radak, as first two the explanations in the Medrash, first one and the third, both of these explanations share a common characteristic, which is that the reason we have this cherem on Yericho is because we want to elevate Yericho in status. It's holier than any other conquered city. Right? Either because it's Kodesh because it was conquered on Shabbat, or because it's challah or truma, it's the first city. So therefore, like its precedent or context, we're going to elevate it, sanctify it, devote it to the mikdash. Yericho is going to have a special status because of its elevated position, kedusha, that is inherent in its conquest. Is that clear? That is fundamentally different from the middle explanation given in this medrash. This middle explanation says, and I think somebody alluded to this last week, briefly mentioned it in passing. Amar Rabbi Brachia Kohen, Ye'ir Hanidachat Asa. Yehoshua declared the city Cherem not because it was more kadosh than any other city, but because it was less kadosh. It was a city that was a symbol of idolatry. And like all idolatry, which is prohibited to benefit from, this entire city, it's not like you have an altar, which is an altar that part of Avodah Zarah, the altar has to be destroyed. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to destroy the altars of idolatry in the land of Israel. Right? That's true. That is, in fact, in Devarim Yud Bet, that's exactly what it says. Abed te'abdun et kol ha'makomot asher avdu sham hagoyim asher atem yoshim otam. You shall destroy all of the places that have an idolatry character to them in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. Because these places are everywhere. They're on hills and they're in valleys, and under every tree, you need to create an idolatry-free zone in the land of Israel. You have to break their altars, dash their pillars. Even if they worship the tree, it has to be burnt. You cannot have any hana, you cannot have any benefit from that which was used in the worship of idols. Destroy any remnant. You cannot create a museum or monument to the ancient pagan idolatries of Canaan. Not allowed to do it. So from that perspective, you have to destroy every altar. But Yericho was different. Because the assumption is that Yericho wasn't just a place where there were temples of Baal or Ashtoreth or idolatry. Yericho was a city that was in its core a representation of the idolatry of Baal. That it represented a city of idolatry that made it unique as an Ir Hanidachat, and I'll explain the concept of an Ir Hanidachat in a moment. And an Ir Hanidachat, Asura B'Hana'ah, is prohibited in all benefit. And we'll see the verse that it has to be burnt to the ground, etc. The concept of an Ir Nidachat is that an Ir Nidachat has to be completely destroyed. An Ir Nidachat is essentially, in the Torah, is essentially a city that is idolatrous. Not just idolatrous, but a city that is kind of a causing others to stray into the world of idolatry. It's leading the charge of an idolatrous world. Now, I know we need a word about, we need to stop here for 1 second and offer a comment about this command to remove idolatry from the land. It's vitally important as we enter into a study of Sefer Yehoshua, and we'll see it again in Sefer Shoftim, that we remember that idolatry wasn't just about worshiping a different God. It wasn't about God being jealous. Oh, I want your service only for me and not for anybody else. The ancient idolatries of Canaan were at their core an immoral culture. They were at their core a culture that was recognizable and identified by sex cults and fertility gods and child sacrifice in the case of Molech and murder, and I can go on. But all of the classic moral inversions that we see in cults today that were part of at the core what pagan idolatry was about. That's why they were so attractive. That's why they were so powerful, because they were so violent and they were so sexual. And therefore the Torah's war against idolatry wasn't just about the divine or the deity of the idolatry, but much more about the cultural draw that these idolatrous cultures had and the impact that they had. That's why the Torah calls them a to'evot, to'eva, the abominations of Canaan. And that's why the Torah places Molech in the list of the prohibited relations in Vayikra, Achemot and Kedoshim, because the two are interconnected. And the mandate to destroy every remnant, every zecher of idolatry was part of that reference or part of that context, and says a city that is idolatrous, a culture that is idolatrous, has to be eradicated. You cannot let it stand in the land of Israel. And there was no Canaanite culture more pervasive, more invasive, and more problematic than Baal, which was a fertility god, a god of rain. That was the Canaanite god of rain. And in many cultures, how did you worship fertility gods? An act of fertility. Use your imagination, willing or unwilling. And so I'm trying to do this in a way that remains PG, but you understand the or at least PG-13, right? But you understand the analogy. And so you get to an Ir Nidachat, which was a city, an Israelite city, that had been brought into this cultural world and was causing others to do so as well. And the Torah goes to war and says, no, even if it's an Israelite city, it has to be destroyed. Kal v'chomer if it's a Canaanite city. So in the next parak, after we just read the psukim that says you have to destroy all the idolatry in the land, there is a mitzvah that says the following. If you hear amongst your cities which God has commanded you to dwell therein, and the people of that city have fallen to the draw, to the temptation of to worship other gods, the Torah's euphemism for pagan idolatry, and you will seek it out. You'll do your inquiry and you'll do your investigation and you'll call your witnesses. And after it's all said and done, this abomination, again, that's not about, an abomination is a term used to describe something which is morally abhorrent. To'eva, I have to put that in perspective here. Not just about, what we call avodah zarah, the euphemism of it, then you shall destroy the city. How? So the rules of an Ir Nidachat are as follows. Haket haket yoshvei ha'irei leficharev. The inhabitants who are guilty of idolatry have to be put to death. There's a whole discussion in the Gemara to separate the ones who aren't guilty from the ones who are guilty. Hacharem ota. Notice the word? Cherem. Vet kol hashirba. Ve'et behemta. Leficharev. By the sword. All that is in therein, including the livestock. Vet kol shlala tikbotz otoch rechova. All of its spoils you bring to the midst of the street. V'sarafta ba'esh etayir. And destroy the city by fire. Vet kol shlala kalil. And all of its spoils. Everything has to be totally destroyed. L'Hashem Elokecha. V'ayta tel olam. Lo tibane od. Shall be destroyed forever, can never be rebuilt. And lo yidbak biyadcha me'umim min acherem. And you are not allowed to take anything of that banned city, or God's anger will come back on you. L'man yeshuv Hashem mecharon apo. That's the story of an Ir Nidachat. So it's characterized by three elements. One is cherem, its inhabitants, its animal livestock. The second is that it's burnt. And the third, that you're not allowed to rebuild the city. Any of that sound familiar? Right. And those are exactly the three elements of Yehoshua's ban on Yericho. He makes that very clear. If I go back to Yeshua Perek Chaf Perek Yuvav, Veyachrimu et kol asher ba'ir me'ish v'ad isha, etc. They lefichara. Right? They destroy everything that's in the city, including the livestock. And then Pasuk of Dalid, Ve'ir sarfu ba'esh. They burnt the city. You don't have to burn a city if it's Kodesh. You don't have to burn the city if it's Kodesh LaHashem because it was sanctified on Shabbos or because it's Truma. You have to burn the city if it's an Ir Nidachat. On the other hand, its gold and silver were brought to the Mikdash, which was not done with an Ir Nidachat, so there's an element of Kedusha there. So that's exactly what the Medrash has both interpretations, because there's elements of an Ir Nidachat, there's elements of Truma or Reshit. So there's both. But the real tell, in my opinion, is Pasuk Avav. וישבע יהושע בעת ההיא לאמור ארור האיש לפני השם אשר יקום ובנה את העיר הזאת את יריחו. The ban on ever rebuilding Yericho. That's classic and unique to a Ir Hanidachat, this kind of condemned city. Now, so I need to understand, why was Yericho an Ir Nidachat? Why is it different than any other idolatry altar? They come to a place, there's a city, and there's an altar and a temple. The altar and the temple had to be destroyed. The city did not necessarily be destroyed. Why was Yericho different? So the suggestion that has been made is either because it was the first idolatrous city they came to and kind of combined these two ideas, or I actually think Yericho has something that made it unique. There is archaeological evidence of ancient idolatry cultures in Yericho. Yericho is a fascinating city because it's the oldest inhabited city in the region. Many suggest it's the oldest inhabited city in the world, but I don't think that's true. But certainly in the Middle East, Yericho has one of the oldest civilizations associated with it. What made Yericho so special? Typically Baal, this god of fertility god that was unique, ubiquitous to the Canaanite culture, is a god of rain. If you want to pray to a god of rain, where do you do so? Where would you build the temples to a god of rain? Interesting question, right? Where would you build a temple to a god of rain? Would you build it in a desert where there's no rain? Would you build it on the top of a mountain so you're closer to the heavens and where the rain falls? In the pagan world, proximity, physicality is very important. And therefore, the pagan temples, for the most part, were haramim, were on high mountains or in hills where there was farmland. Right? That's typically where you would find idolatry. What's the most famous altar built to Baal in Sefer in Tanakh that we know of, that's recorded in Tanakh? Mount Carmel. Eliyahu's famous showdown with the prophets of Baal in the time of Achab. It was on the top of Mount Carmel, because if you're praying to a god of rain, the higher you are, the better. Why would you build a culture of Baal in Yericho? Yericho's in the desert. Yericho's in one of the lowest parts of the land of Canaan, or land of Israel. But Yericho has something unique to it. Anybody ever been to Yericho? Okay. What's unique to Yericho?
Years ago.
When you
there were some beautiful trees. I remember trees.
What kind of trees?
The big palm trees.
Palm trees. And palm trees grow.
We're talking about decades
It's an oasis.
Correct. Yericho sits on an oasis. Yericho sits on water, underground water. Yericho, in many ways, is a part of what we would refer to as, what is referred to in Sefer Bereshit as Arei HaKikar, the plains that had special cities sitting on oases, and therefore, like Mitzrayim, Kigan Hashem Ke'eretz Mitzrayim, they were irrigated by the Nile, or like by the Nile in Egypt. They didn't need rain to support crops. They had underground water, but that meant that there was almost like a place of water on steroids. It was like the Canaanite culture could flourish there because it had natural water, and in an ancient world, you didn't necessarily know where that water came from, but it had a never-ending source of water, unlike other places in the land that had less constant source of water. And so Yericho became a symbol of this Baal culture until Yehoshua goes in and destroys it. And to fulfill that mandate to destroy the culture of the temples and the altars of idolatry, in Yericho's case, meant you had to destroy Yericho itself. And you had to declare Yericho off limits. Yericho was and remained for generations a symbol of that Baal culture. How do I know? Beyond the sort of archaeological evidence to ancient temples, etc., we have a very powerful Tanakh source to support this theory that Yericho represented the culture of the pagan idolatry of Baal, which was Canaanite on steroids, to use that expression. Wow. Let's move forward for a moment in time, all the way to the time of Achav, who is the first king of Israel. Remember, the story of Baal is that the Canaanite culture of Baal is pervasive throughout Sefer Shoftim. And it really takes all the way to the beginning of Sefer Shmuel until Shmuel Hanavi comes to finally put down all remnants of Baal in the land of Israel and eradicate and remove the cultural draw of the Baal of Zara from the land of Israel. That was the case, and it stayed that way throughout the period of Sefer Shmuel, time of Shaul, time of David, time of Shlomo, the beginning of Sefer Malachim. The first king of Israel to reintroduce Baal into the land of Israel as a cultural force was none other than our dear friend Achav. So that's where the story begins. We're going to jump to Malachim Aleph Perek Tet Zayin. Achav ben Omer. Achav becomes the nemesis, or would be the challenge to Eliyahu Hanavi. Eliyahu's worldview. Eliyahu comes into the scene to fight Achav's reintroduction of Baal into the land of Israel. That's what Eliyahu's mandate is. Achav ben Omi malach Yisrael בשנת 38 שנה לעשה מלך יהודה וימלוך Achav ben Omi על ישראל בשומרון 22 שנה. Achav ben Omi became the king of Israel, northern kingdom, 22 years. Vayas Achav ben Omi hara b'nei Hashem mikol asher lefanav. Achav was worse than anybody who came before, which is an expression used often and far too often in Sefer Malachim, but uniquely so here. Vahi hanakel lechto. It was not enough for him to follow in the northern kingdom's footsteps of the Egel of Yeravam ben Nevat, in a sense, the unique Israelite idolatry, if you will, right? To worship a golden calf. Right? So Yeravam ben Nevat had put an Egel in Beit El and an Egel in Dan, and that was his way of identifying their breach from Torah. That wasn't enough for Achav. Achav had to go one step further. He had to prove he was more Canaanite than the Canaanites. Vayikach Isha. So he took as his wife Izevel bat et Baal melech Tzidonim. He took a Canaanite wife who was not just a Canaanite princess. She was Izevel bat et Baal. Notice in the Canaanite world, which is true in the Israelite world too, they would borrow the names of their deities and embed them into their identity. So Et Baal is Ish Baal, and Izevel is Eshet Baal. What is known in English as Jezebel, but Izevel bat Et Baal. There was no princess in the ancient world that represented the culture of Baal more than her, besides the fact that she was so evil. That was Achav. Achav wanted to bring Baal back to the land of Israel. He wanted it for political reasons. He wanted to fit into the broader culture of the world around him, etc. We can unpack that when we get to Sefer Malach. He built a Mizbeach for Baal. Called it Beit Baal, the house of Baal. And he built it in the Shomron. But even that's not enough. Baal has a consort, fertility gods, male, female, they have a consort. The consort of Baal, which is the god of rain, is the tree that grows from the rain the Baal produces. So now you have Baal, now you have Asherah or Ashtoret, and you've got everything. But we're not that's not enough. Vayosef achav la'asot la'achis et Hashem Elokei Yisrael mikol malchei Yisrael asher yilu lefanav. He went one step further, more than any other god, king before him, to provoke God. What did he do? Not enough to have an altar to Baal, and not enough to have a Asherah to Baal. He needs a city that is a monument to Baal. And so biyamav bana Chiel bet Eli et Yericho. He sends Chiel from Bet El to build Yericho, to rebuild Yericho. And then the curse of Yehoshua applies. Ba'aviram b'choro yista, u'vizkuv tzilo hitzil tlateh. With his firstborn, Aviram, he laid its foundations. With his youngest, Seguv, he set up its gates. And he nevertheless pursued the mandate to rebuild the city of Baal as a temple tribute, the entire city to Baal, the city, building the city of Yericho, and paid the price. And this, by the way, is further evidence that actually God did command the cherem to Yehoshua, even though it's not recorded in Sefer in our text, because it says according to the word of God which he spoke to Yehoshua. So that's the story of Achav. At the other end of the spectrum, from our perspective, it stands to reason, therefore, that that when they put the ban on Yericho, they did so as an ir nidachat, because Yericho wasn't just a temple to Baal, it was a city in its oasis. It was a city that had become symbolic with and synonymous with the idolatry of Baal. Is that helpful? Okay. That's what I call option 1 and 2. Either it's Kodesh because it's Shabbos, or it's Kodesh because it's Challah, or it's Asur B'Hana, it's prohibited in any benefit, and it's an ir nidachat like Yericho, like the idolatry of Baal. That brings us to 2 other possibilities, which we're not going to have time to finish today. We're going to begin one, and B'ezrat Hashem, we will complete it. And I want to look at 2 additional reasons. One will start today, and the other will finish next week or next year, as to why Yericho was unique. Let me, at this moment, before we come to the end of this year, pause for a second, take questions. But before I do, an announcement, which I meant to make at the beginning of this year, which is that next week I am away. I'm at a conference, and so there is no shir. Keep slipping on that. There's no shir next week. They'll send out a reminder notice from the Torah Motion office. Our next shir will be B'ezrat Hashem in 2 weeks' time. Okay. Having said that, I'm going to pause here for questions, because before I move to a whole new subject.
I believe you mentioned that because Hashem fought this war by himself, it was an
Yeah, we'll get to that.
miraculous.
That's our 4th explanation, which we'll come to last. We'll get to that B'ezrat Hashem in a couple of weeks. But that needs to be kind of put into its own context. There's a much bigger picture there, so we'll leave that for a moment.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Achav was the king of Shomron. Yericho is not in Yehuda's territory, or in Shimon's
Depends on how you
territory.
build it. It depends on how you
How is the connection? That's the first thing. Second question, and then so the name Yericho, I thought was coming from the fact that they worshipped the god of the moon from Yareach. So I don't know where is the.
I don't know. That might be the case, but that would be very old. Remember, Yericho is the oldest known civilized city in the Middle East. It goes back tens of thousands of years.
Right.
So whether that's true or not, I don't know.
I don't
but
know.
it's certainly, but there's a long journey from where, the ancient idolatries of the Rambam's description of worshiping the sun and the moon to pagan idolatries that we're describing here.
Okay.
But if you look at there's not, I don't have a map here of the dividing of the tribes, but it's entirely possible that, remember, he's king in the area of the entire Shomron. The
Right.
border between them is Beit El, uh,
Oh,
and Yericho is rebuilt by a Chiel from Beit El. Beit El was the border between Yerushalayim and of Yehuda and Yisrael. So it's entirely possible that Yericho lay in the territorial boundaries of the Shemon, or of Binyamin. I'm going to see quickly if I have a map.
But Ahav had to do with it. Remember when Eliyahu came to visit him?
Yeah, so the whole story of Eliyahu comes in the Medrash, starts from the Shiva call he pays to Chiel Beit Eli. That's correct.
Right.
But and the Medrash is picking up on exactly this issue, that Eliyahu goes to war with Baal, and the culture of Baal, and the symbol of that was Chiel Beit Eli, no question.
Right.
then there was Baal everywhere, like Tachat Kol Etz Ra'anan, it says. So I don't understand. So why Dafka
But there's
Yericho?
that's my point. There's a difference between a temple or an altar of Baal and a city that represented Baal in its core because of the physical nature in which the city was built.
Okay.
Because Yericho is an oasis in a desert, and it's the only oasis in the land of Israel, in the land of Canaan, Yericho became the symbol of that Baal world. So you didn't need a temple to Baal. You didn't need an altar to Baal. That could be broken. Yericho was a city to Baal. That needs to be destroyed. That's the difference.
Okay, thanks.
All right. The last piece of it picks up on a whole different nuance, which I think somebody mentioned last week, and I said we'll come back to it. Unfortunately, we're not going to finish it. We're not going to get to all of it today. But there's another element to this Battle of Yericho that we need to understand that has to do with the fact that it's the first campaign in the land of Israel. And Yehoshua is I'm trying to deliberate which order to do this in. There's a phrase here that is particularly troublesome. That was an intentional pun. If anybody picked it up. Phrase here: if you violate the cherem of Yericho, samtemet machanel lecherem va'achartem oto. If you violate the cherem of Yericho, you will cause the camp of Israel to become troubled. Achar. Achar with an ayin, very, very powerful word. And it's not used often. It's used in a context of an accusation of something which has now been identified as a kind of a cause of all the troubles around us. Eliyahu and Achav, by the way, when they have the showdown on Har Carmel, Eliyahu accuses Achav of being an Ocher Yisrael, which is, in modern terminology, modern Hebrew, is a very ugly curse, right? Somebody who's called Ocher Yisrael is somebody who's like a traitor to Israel. But in the context, it's the cause of all the trouble is because your devotion to Baal. And Achav turns to Eliyahu and says he's the Ocher Yisrael because the 3-year drought that he declared has caused mass casualties and death, and Eliyahu declared that drought without God's authorization. So Achav accuses Eliyahu of being Ocher Yisrael, and Eliyahu accuses Achav of being Ocher Yisrael. That's the context of this term. It's intense. And it only appears in a few places. It appears in Eliyahu-Achav conflict. It appears here. It appears in the story of Achan, who violates the cherem. Vayomer Yehoshua, in Perek Zayin, Vayomer Yehoshua to Achan, who violated the cherem and was the cause of the failure at Ai. And he says to him, Ma achartanu, why have you caused our trouble? Ya'akorcha Hashem b'yom hazeh. God should cause you trouble. In fact, they named the place Emak Achor, the valley of Achor, the valley of trouble. Very famous nevuah in Neviim Achronim, Vaya Emak Achor lePetach Tikva. To the source of the name of the modern city of Petach Tikva. But Ma'achartanu, one of the places where the term achar as a cause of trouble is used. And that links that story to our Perek. And that is Shmuel Aleph, Perek Yudalad. A very famous battle, Shaul's first battle against the Plishtim. It's referred to as the Battle of Michmas. It's 2 chapters long, so we're not going to have time to unpack it all, but I just want to show you the particular phrase that we're talking about. In that battle, in that moment, there is a battle, they're chasing after the Plishtim. And in the midst of this chase, God saves them and he gives them a great victory. Vayoel Shaul et ha'am lemor. Shaul mandated an oath, adjured the people. He forced the people to take an oath, saying, Arur ha'isha sheyochal lechem ad ha'erev. Cursed is any man who eats food until this evening. And if he violates that oath, right? And until I'm avenged of my enemies, no food. And the people kept that oath, right? They didn't eat. Now, you understand, you can't, it's very hard to fight an army, to fight a war as an army, if you don't let them eat, if you don't provide food or rations. So the army is exhausted, they're tired, they're running, they're chasing, they're fighting, and Shaul makes them take an oath that they will not eat. Why? Unclear. We'll see. We will explore it. They entered into a forest, and there was dvash up near Sadeh. Now, I don't like this translation. Dvash is translated, we're going to actually run out of time, I'm not going to be able to do all of this, but dvash here is translated as honey. The word dvash in Tanakh does not mean only honey. The word dvash can refer to all ripe fruit. When the Torah describes the land of Israel as a land flowing with milk and honey, Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, the chalav is not flowing through the rivers. The water is flowing through the rivers, the water is flowing through the rain, causing the land to be fertile and produce enough grass so that you can have well-fed cows to provide milk. So a land flowing with milk is a land that is fertile and has lots of grazing land for its cows. Dvash is fruit, ripe fruit. Torah says on the Mizbech, you were never allowed to bring chametz and fruit. Kol so'or v'chol dvash lo yavo al Mizbech. Okay, that's dvash. How it came to be translated as honey is a dvash dvorim, I'm not sure.
Because of pasuk kafvav, it says Ya'arat Advash. Ya'arat Advash is the chala of the dvash, so that's why.
Not sure. But okay, it doesn't matter. You can have fruit. You can have, doesn't matter. You can have fruit in a forest too, right? Ripe fruit doesn't have to be honey.
No,
Okay,
but
in this case, I think it's a reference. It doesn't matter. In this case, I think it's a. Hang on a second. In this case, I think it's a reference to the sap of the tree, but it doesn't matter. They come into this forest, and there is much dvash, whether it be fruit or the saps of trees. Well, I don't think it's referring to bee honey. I think it's referring to something in the trees. No man touched it. They're afraid of the oath. Except for Yonatan. Yonatan, what? Okay, now we're going to get into the details of it. I can't go there because I'm going to run out of time. But Yonatan violates the oath. Yonatan takes of the food. They tell him, what did you do? Etc. And he explains. anyway, at the end of the story, we have the phrase, that's not what I'm looking for. Yonatan says of his father and his father's oath, Yonatan achar avi et haaretz. My father's caused all the trouble in the land. All right. Father-son relationships between Shaul and Yonatan is a separate topic. Nonetheless, for our purposes, we need to understand the connection between this Achai Yisrael, the battle of Achav and Eliyahu over Baal, the battle of Yericho and Achan. And here, how did we get to Mechemet Mechmas and Achar Aviat Aretz and his Dvash? What's the connection there? That B'ezrat Hashem, we will begin with in our next shir in 2 weeks' time. Please remember, there's no shir next week. In 2 weeks' time, that's number one. And then we'll come to the last piece, B'ezrat Hashem, which is an understanding of another reason that makes Yericho unique, and that has to do with the Malach. And coming back to the story with which we began, what role the Malach played in the story. So all of that is before us. We will journey ahead. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Happy to stay on for a few minutes if there are more questions.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
It could be that the honey was given the name for Dvash because the translators were in a climate where honey was more common than the dates, the date spread and stuff
Chazal
like that.
to
There were
Dvash
so
Tamarim.
many bad translations. A malach is not a Christian angel. A malach is a messenger from God with one little job, versus a Nevi, who's a messenger of God with a message. So it's like tons and tons of words people have all confused. And I'm on this pet peeve. My pet peeve has been trying to correct it because it's gotten into Hebrew where people they speak Hebrew, native Hebrew speakers, and they're totally oblivious to the fact that they're totally misusing the words.
I'm not sure I agree with you with Malach, because we have Malachim in Tanakh that are certainly Malachei Elokim, that are certainly some kind of spiritual being. You have them all through Sefer Breshit and in Shoftim.
But they look like people. They don't have wings.
They don't have wings,
and
that's
they're
for
not
sure.
like
But
the Christian
what
angels.
they look like,
it's
is nobody knows. So that's debatable. But they certainly they can be disguised as people. They're not. Anyway, that's a whole different.
They're not flying creatures.
Yeah, but okay. But as far as Dvash goes, Dvash Tamarim Chazal referred to as a date. But there's no question you can see it in the pasuk about the Mizbeach that Dvash is the Torah's term for ripe fruit. What Soor is to bread, Dvash is to fruit. The chametz
in that place where it says Ya'ara, that's why it to me it seems like that. And then Chalachet Mateo, so if it was fruit, he would send his hair, he would pick.
Depends how tall the fruit is. Dvash Tamarim is very high.
That's true.
Right? It depends on where it is. That I'm not convinced. But
anyway, I found Yericho. It's in Binyamin, so you're right. So then Bethel was also in Binyamin. So that was
Bethel for sure is Binyamin.
Yeah, no, that's it. So I'm saying I looked at it, and Yericho is also in the part of Binyamin. So it makes a lot of sense. The only thing is that Binyamin joined Yehuda actually.
So the edge, but that's city by city.
That's weird, but okay, I to figure it out because Binyamin went with Yehuda and not with the northern tribes.
But
so
again,
why would it happen?
Borders can shift and cities can be, city here and a city there.
I just want to ask something.
Yeah,
now,
by all means.
Zevel's name was really Isbaal.
Correct.
Right? So the people called her Izebel in order to disparage her?
So that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer. I do know that there are instances in Tanakh where it's unclear whether it was contemporary or whether it was later. But for example, Gidon is referred to as somebody who waged war with Baal because he broke the altar of Baal. And the followers of Baal nicknamed Gidon Yerubbaal, as the one who fought against Baal.
Right.
So there are instances where, and that's in the Shoftim, that's Perek Vav. There's also the case of of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was one of Yonatan's children, and Mephibosheth in Sefer Shmuel is referred to as Mephibaal in Sefer Devarim. And so it's possible that that was also changed or modified to kind of poke at the culture of Baal.
I know
So
in
it's
our
possible. I don't know about Izebel, whether or not that was her name, because in Aramaic cultures, in Semitic languages, there are certain letters that are interchangeable. So Iz can be Isha or Eshet Baal. It would be Iz Baal. And Et Baal by her father would be Ish Baal. So I'm not sure that that is the case here, but I think in this case it might be more a function of actually her name or something close to it that represented an embrace of Baal rather than a pejorative.
I know that
She
they say in our
surely did.
language, say Havir Gilulim in our arts instead of Elilim, you know?
Yeah, that's already much later. That's already the language of Chazal and the Tefillah, which is undergoes much censorship. So that's a whole different. We'll leave that for now. All right. Thank you very much for listening and appreciate your time. And we will see you all B'ezrat Hashem in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
My pleasure.